You're listening to eLearnChat, where talk is knowledge.
Hello and welcome to eLearnChat, our new podcast featuring prominent leaders, shakers and movers in the e-learning and training industry.
Good morning, everyone. This is eLearnChat episode number 53, and it is April 4th, a beautiful overcast day in California. Wherever you are, we hope you're having a good day. If you're in the chat room, thanks for being there. And if you're watching the show later on, please subscribe and leave comments. We'd love to hear from you. Well, today we've got, as always, our co-host. Hey, Coline, how are you?
I'm doing great, Rick. How about yourself?
I am doing well. It's early in the morning, and we're bright and cheery.
Yes.
We're almost awake, right?
I'm sorry?
We're almost awake.
We're almost awake, yes. Almost.
Tell us about our guest today.
Okay. Today, our guest on eLearnChat is Renie McClay. And Renie helps companies to effectively deliver and facilitate training to global audiences. Her passport is stamped with over 35 countries. And she's also authored The Essential Guide to Training Global Audiences, Fortify Your Sales Force, Leading and Training Exceptional Teams, and 10 Steps to Successful Teams.
That's great.
Renie has managed training departments for several Fortune 500 companies. Her success comes from her expertise and extensive experience and passion for learning and developing people all over the globe. She's also trained with Second City and uses improvisation as a tool to help organizations develop more productive and innovative teams. So welcome, Renie. Thank you for joining us on
Hi, Renie.
eLearnChat.
How are you?
Yeah, thank you both. I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
So you're in a dreary day there. I'm actually in a sunny day in Chicago.
Yeah, go figure, right?
Yes.
So anyway, so you've done improvisation, Second City work.
I've done some of that.
That's great.
Yeah, it's a great way to spend. I spent a year of Saturdays doing that. That's a fun Saturday.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, and you used some of that in your training, I imagine.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of that in your training.
Yeah, all trainers certainly improvise. Anybody in front of the room is finding themselves in situations they weren't planning and improvising. But there are also some tools you can use within kind of classroom dynamics and classroom interaction that are improv-based activities and exercises. So that adds a little fun, a little life.
That's good. Hey, tell us a little bit about 35 countries. That's a lot of countries to travel to. Was that all training related?
No, it wasn't. When I was 23 or 24, I took a trip to Europe, visited 6 countries, and it kind of changed my life. So I saw the world. I'm a Kansas girl. And so going to Europe was pretty amazing. So I just started traveling and liking it. And then I found the profession of learning and performance, like that facilitation piece. So I was looking for ways to combine it, and so that's all worked out now.
That's pretty good. Did you do that? Yeah. Did you do the Euro pass when you were in Europe?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
We were young, and we actually were adventuresome, and we rented a car.
Ah, interesting. I remember when I was in my 20s, everybody was going to Europe with that Euro pass.
Yeah.
And going from one end to the other, and it looked like a lot of fun. I wanted to do it, but never got around to it.
Yeah.
Looked like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Hey, Coline, anybody in the chat room, any comments or any questions yet?
Yeah, of course. I would love to welcome Jeff and Leva to the chat room. Leva is in Belgium and Jeff is in Australia. So it's kind of awesome having them here with us live today because our topic is going to be engaging global audiences.
So we have a couple of globals right now in the audience.
Yeah, we do.
I appreciate that.
So we can get started, Renie. What would you like to share with us today?
Well, just the topic of engaging audiences that are either cross-cultural or that are global in different countries, and either via e-learning, via virtual training, or via face-to-face training. We can talk about any of those things.
Now, you brought a little slideshow.
I did. I got a couple of slides. So that's
I can bring
that's actually my website.
All right, so this is your website here. Let's bring that up. And that's Inspired Learning?
Yes.
InspiredLearning.net.
Is Inspired Learning. And then if you want to show the next slide, actually, that's an interesting topic to kick us off. I had a trip to India. I had trained in Africa. I trained in England. I had trained in a couple places in Europe and enjoyed it very much. But I got a chance to go to India and train to different audiences, corporate, non-for-profits, and universities. So the next slide, so this is the cover slide, Engaging Global Audiences. The next slide, actually, Rick, is I got a chance to visit the Mount Carmel College in India.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got to speak on building relationships in business to 250 students in the master's department. And I after the presentation, this is kind of a subset of the women who came up to me after the presentation, and they were very excited. They were wanting business cards. They were wanting to chat. They walked me to the ladies' room. They were carrying my bag. They were so excited, and they explained to me they don't have a lot of women mentors in business and in education in India. So they're very, very excited about the connection and asking all kinds of great questions and telling me all about what they do. And that, from a professional standpoint, really changed my life. So my first trip to Europe kind of changed my worldview, changed my life. This really solidified that this is what I need to be doing. I need to be, kind of connecting people from different cultures, visiting countries, training multicultural groups, because it was life impactful to see these young women who were, and all of the students really, who were very attentive. They're looking for tools, they want to be successful. They're at this age of their life where they're full of passion. And so it was a really great experience. So that's really one of the things, you could see why, why an event like that would be impactful, and kind of change your life. So.
And now we've moved on. This is the next slide after that.
Yeah. So one of the things that people ask frequently, is what are the differences? So when you go, everybody kind of knows, you got to be careful. You're training a new audience for the first time. You're in a new country for the first time. You can step in things unintentionally because of language issues, because of cultural issues. So these are just a list of some of the kind of top line things that you need to be careful about. So if you're training, if you're facilitating a group, if you're writing online learning, working, whether it's e-learning or whether it's with live groups, these are some of the things that you want to be careful about. The geographic and historical references can be offensive, because there's a lot of thousands of years of history that we don't necessarily know about. So it's hard to know who's really allies and who's, and who's not. Sports analogies, obviously, they don't transfer. People use a football reference, like an American football reference, trying to prove a point, and it's not necessarily gonna translate for them. So some of these things are obvious, jargons, acronyms, abbreviations. Homophones are usually okay in writing, but when you're speaking, you have to be careful of them. And then references, depending on the region of the country, references to the body, to sex, alcohol, politics should be stayed away altogether. And humor is kind of a slippery slope as well, because my gift is sarcasm, and it's not a great gift. It's not a great gift when you're with an audience that isn't necessarily going to pick up on the fact that I said that sarcastically, but to them it just kind of sounds weird.
They may take it literally.
Yeah, or perhaps.
Yeah, and humor is a slippery slope regardless of whether it's a global audience or not, because sometimes I try to use humor even in my tweets, and it doesn't translate for the receiver. it can be misinterpreted. So I think humor is something that, we have to tread carefully when we try to be funny.
You've actually used humor in your tweets?
I see. That's what I'm talking about.
That's new. Yeah. And what I recommend is self-effacing humor about yourself.
Right.
That's probably okay. But humor at somebody else's expense, humor at a manager's expense, humor at a country's expense, it might not be so okay.
No, in fact, it's a rather interesting point. Here, we don't necessarily treat managers with a lot of respect or with a lot of hierarchy. You go to a lot of other countries and they do. It's very different. I've worked with teams in India as well, and they're much more hierarchical. The boss is the boss, and they are treated with actually quite a bit of respect. And that's something we don't have. We used to have it, but we don't have that really anymore. Even in Europe, there is a big difference. In Europe, if you go and you talk to a professor is highly respected. Not necessarily here. Right. It's very different and it also varies, like you said, from country to country. It's always fascinating to see the differences and what works, what doesn't work, and how people take things.
Yes.
Now, the good part is because we're Americans, they tend to think, oh, well, whatever, they're Americans. And that kind of helps a little bit defray, some of the issues, but it's still, like you said, becoming culturally aware of where you are and the things you can say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and there are training implications with that. So when somebody's planning learning, whether it's classroom or in e-learning or whatever, they need to plug into that in their assessment because Gert Hofstede did research many years ago on cultures and communication. He's really considered one of the experts in this area, and he calls that power distance. So he's really looking at like how much distance is there between kind of who's at the top and who's not. So in countries like India, many Asian countries, Korea, even West Africa, there's a large difference between like the professor, or even the parent or the manager or the business leader, and the subordinates. There's a reverence, there's a deferential kind of attitude toward them. But then many countries, the U.S. being one of them, it's not so much. So it's easy for somebody here to go there and offend a manager just by not introducing the manager first or letting the manager introduce himself first before they introduce the rest of the group, or even where they sit.
Talking to a subordinate instead of the manager.
Yes.
There's a lot of little things that you have to just be a little, and in Asia in particular, you have to be a little more careful.
Yeah, so you can find out those things. You just need to ask, like where, you're not going to say it in these words, but you're looking for where are the landmines, where are the things, where are the problem areas, and that I need to be attentive to, so that I don't offend.
One of my favorites.
And also, go ahead.
I'm sorry. One of my favorites is gestures. You have to be careful what kind of gestures you make. They're not all the
absolutely.
same. They're not all the same. Make the okay sign to a German, and they think you've just insulted them.
Right.
To add to what you guys, what you just said, Rick and Renie, about, there's a certain level of informality here in the U.S. that I've encountered since I've been living here. And one of the most startling things for me, because I moved here, to go to school, was being in a class, at the beginning of the semester, and the professor introducing themselves, and students would raise their hands and say things like, so, well, what can we call you? So, for example, if the professor's name is Professor Tom Jones, instead of it being understood that that's how you refer to them, or that's how you address them as Professor Jones, there's this level of casualness and informality where people feel the need to call the professors by their first names. And the shocking thing for me was that professors were okay with that. In my culture, where I'm from, you cannot do that. I mean, it's just unheard of. And so even though I've fostered, relationships, friendships with my professors since graduating, I still feel very uncomfortable calling them by their first names, and they insist on it, and I just can't do it. it's just not part of what I'm used to.
And in fact, whenever we refer to Coline, it is the divine Ms. Coline to everyone.
Not.
And we always bow first. That's just it's a rule.
With the gong, right?
With the gong. Okay, there's your gong.
There you go.
Hey, I brought my own sound effect. Can you hear it? Just in case we need it. Because I know you're a sound effects group.
We do sometimes.
I'm going to shut it off before it gets to the boom chakalaka, boom chakalaka.
All right, and here is the next slide.
Okay, planning for contingencies. One of the areas that both people developing learning and facilitating learning can get really tripped up on is unexpected things happening. And things like, you get there and there's no power, and if you don't have, there are countries where they just lose power for 20 or 30 minutes, maybe for half a day, maybe for all day. Major companies will often have a backup. I've been speaking at a college, and they were introducing me, and it's time to go on, and there was no power. So it was only like maybe a 20-minute, interruption because they could turn on a backup power source. But I suggest people bring something in paper. Don't make assumptions. So if you need your PowerPoints in paper, bring them. If you're going to need something for participants to look at, in case there's no power, plan for that.
That's interesting.
So power failures, of course, that's going to affect internet and different technology pieces.
Now I have room. We in California have the same issue right now. We have power failures all the time. We never used to.
Yeah.
It's we've actually had to cancel one of the shows once because we were out for 3 hours.
Wow.
This is we've rapidly declined over here. The infrastructure is breaking.
Yeah, so, and about a week ago I had a power outage for 5-6 hours.
That's true. You were down almost a whole day.
Mm-hmm.
That's common here, but it's associated typically with storms.
Right. No, here it's just bad infrastructure. We're not maintaining it like we used to.
Mm-hmm.
And there's 40 million people in California. That's a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, the thing about power and internet and understanding that is if you're expecting people to do e-learning, for an example, that are around the world, it's very common in India, it's very common in other parts of Asia for a family to have one computer, and it'll probably be right in the center of things. So for somebody to be able to listen, participate in meetings, it's going to be from their home. It's going to be a busy place. And in India, could be a lot of people living in that house. It could be an extended family living in that house. So I've managed resources around the world before, and frequently they have to start working at 11 o'clock at night because that's when the house is quiet. And, or they'll be in the middle of something. I've been in the middle of a call with something, and they have to get up and go have dinner with their family. Mm-hmm. Because they don't have a choice, they have to do that. Right. And so then we have to hang up. We have to continue business, after their dinner hours over. So getting to know all of those facts, getting to know, when you roll out with something from an e-learning standpoint, when are they going to do it? What does it look like? Who's around them? Who's competing for the computer? And then who's competing for, just attention from a chatter, activity standpoint? Those are good considerations to think about.
That's good. All right, and we're moving to the next slide here.
Yeah, so a few years ago, I wrote a book with Luann Irwin, and it's The Essential Guide to Training Global Audiences. And it covers some major topics like things like we're talking about: design, facilitation, managing translation. If you haven't worked with a classroom interpreter, there's some things to know there. That's different, and kind of people need to practice that to get in a little bit of a rhythm. And then there's also over 30 specific countries that we look at from a standpoint of what do you need to know about getting there, about being there, about presenting there, and so that's a resource. That's a resource if people are interested. And then another one that I'll show you. So that's that resource. Another one that I'll show you is this Gert Hofstede that I told you about, the big research guy, culture guy.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Lewis actually has a book, When Cultures Collide. And
can you raise that? Can you raise that just a little bit? Okay.
Raise it some more, Renie.
When Cultures Collide. Okay.
Okay.
Cultures Collide.
Awesome.
So then I probably didn't do this one right in. So how about that?
That's perfect.
So if you want to dive deeper from a culture standpoint, you could research if you're going to a new country or you're designing things for new countries. Those are a couple of resources that will help you dive down a little bit.
That sounds good. And then here is the final slide of the presentation.
Yeah, just lots of faces. Just lots of faces.
Yep.
Yeah, so many countries, many companies, are doing more globally, and so this is a topic that lots of people are interested in. What used to happen is companies would create an American curriculum and roll it out across the world, and then not be so happy with the way it's all playing out, and come back and say, we don't understand why this didn't, why people didn't grab a hold of this. And it's because in the design phase, they weren't really thinking about who they were designing it for.
What are some of the more common things that fail when you design for a global marketplace?
Well, things like onboarding new people, around the world, that's going to look different. So you want a certain experience when you hire new employees. How do you create one that's sensitive to everybody? But it's also even just big national meetings. Sorry about that. National sales meetings that are cross-cultural, that there's many people attending. There are companies that pay special attention to the audience in the room for that. So they look at in-country, like they have in-country contacts or cultural contacts that are on the design team, that are on the steering team for creating these, so that when they create videos, for an example, they're using colors that work, they're using music that is, like, they're not like taking like all the American things and putting them in something and then rolling them out. So people will see glimpses of their culture within whatever curriculum or videos are rolling out. So it could be anything from new hire orientation kind of information. It could be job skills training. It could be how they train and what do they do with their policy. How do they communicate policy around the world when there's so many differences. So those are some of the things that the companies are now looking at. What are different ways of doing it and what are different considerations when we do it? Yeah, we talked about the management considerations. There's also gender considerations.
Right.
So there are countries in India, and in Africa. I was advised, let people sit where they want to sit. If the women want to sit together at a table, let them, because that's where they're going to be the most comfortable.
Right.
So in America, we tend to shake that up. We tend to mix everybody up. There are places that really, it's just going to be distracting. It's not going to help learning. It's not going to help the learning transfer. So let them sit where they're comfortable. And let that dictate your choices rather than what you as a facilitator prefer.
That's true. One of the things that get Americans in trouble a little bit is that sometimes, especially from a managerial point of view, we're dealing with projects and we tend to be quick, rat-a-tat. You give a phone call and they're very quick. Did you do this? Without the pleasantries of, hi, how are you? How's your family doing? And that can affect some cultures too, where they feel that we don't care. Right. And for example, with the Indian culture, they are a warm culture. they're very similar to the Latin culture, actually. I've dealt a lot with Latin cultures, and I find that the Indian culture is almost the same. If you're very friendly, if you're very engaging with them about their families, what they're doing, how their kids are, it's just like a Latin culture. There's really no difference in that respect, and you can establish a better relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yes.
and so it makes for an interesting learning experience, especially if you're quick to rat-a-tat things, or you just
Right.
kind of you're not paying attention to those little personal things. That could really turn people off to the American way, if you will. And
Right.
sometimes we are a little too. We got to get it done,
Right.
and so it's one of those changes. Colleen, you were about to say something?
Yeah, I have a question from the chat room, and Jeff would like to know, what would you say would be the 5 things in training that seem to work cross-culturally, regardless of the culture? 5 things.
Oh, really interesting question. So one of the things that comes to mind is rapport building. So setting up some rapport, trying to get to know people, having a facilitation style that lends itself to getting to know people. I would say showing respect. That's going to be universal. There are countries you can't that it's possible for you not to show the proper respect to, but I don't think there's countries that you can give too much respect to. So being respectful. One is being careful with humor, like using humor in moderation and being careful, because of course sarcasm can get me in trouble in the United States, as well as in Europe. So let's see, that's 3. I would say being attentive to interaction. So there are countries that case studies and group discussions and group teachbacks and, big kind of boisterous icebreakers. There are countries that works really well in, but be ready to tone things down in cultures that are less receptive to it. So I would say that. Is that 5?
I have rapport building, respect, humor, attention to interaction. Did I miss one?
Yeah. And then I would just say demonstrating flexibility. So knowing that there are things you're going to need to, there might be things you need to change on the fly. So an adaptable and flexible trainer will be able to cope with, different transportation, different hotel, different food, showing up with a plan in the classroom, realizing that it's not going to work, it's not working as well as you thought it was going to work, and being able to adapt. So I think those kinds of things would work most places.
It's real interesting because not only does that work overseas, it works within the U.S. as well, where you have different regions. If you go to the South, much more respectful than they are, let's say, on the coasts.
Right.
Midwest, again, a little more respectful, more the way people communicate is just a little bit different. And it is interesting how it varies. Again, you go coastal, very, very different mindset, much more relaxed, much more laid back in terms of respect and everything else. And I remember traveling to Georgia a couple of times, or any other part, in a couple of other places in the South, and there's always a yes sir, yes ma'am, and you go, wow, haven't heard that in ages.
Yes.
And it's actually not bad. I think we're losing what's not a bad thing, because being respectful of somebody you don't know is a good thing. Yeah.
And I imagine, to add to that, Rick, that, you talk about it being regional or geographical. I from my perspective, I think it's also depending on the age of the organization. For the older organizations, there seem to be more structure, more formality, versus the newer organizations, the startups, where they probably all started in a warehouse building or something, and they all sat next to each other. The organizations that have been around perhaps 2-3 years, they're probably less formal than, say, an organization that started at the turn of the last century in the 1900s.
Well, I think that applies in tech companies, but it doesn't apply in distribution manufacturing where there's much more of a hierarchy. You've got the office people, you've got the management, you've got the production people, the manufacturing folks, and there are different lines in those organizations, much more so than you get in a tech company where techies tend to be techies.
Right.
So I think that's another divide. You've got young techies and you've got other people working in different kinds of labor. And you've got white collar, blue collar, you've got just all sorts of different mixes. Whereas in techie companies, everybody's just sort of a techie.
Now, Renie, I imagine that, you have all these books, etc., and you've traveled considerably, that there are occasions when, things happen and you're just not prepared for it.
Yes.
How does that work?
Well, you just, you got to improvise. You got to adapt, you got to be flexible, you got to improvise. So one thing that was just a funny thing that happened, when I wrote this book, The Essential Guide to Training Global Audiences, my co-author and I, we interviewed over 60 people to get, there are some really funny and helpful and humorous things that, anecdotes that are written in the book. One thing that happened to me when I was training in India is I was speaking to a group of college professors, fairly good sized room of college professors, and I went to, when my coworker was speaking, there were two of us. When my coworker was speaking, I was noticing in the back of the room, like clear in the back, there was an air conditioning unit up in the corner, and these little kind of chipmunk ground squirrels were kind of running in and out and playing in the air conditioner. So, I don't know, 5 or 6 little chipmunky looking things. So she finished, she sat down, and I started speaking, and the chipmunks charged the stage. Now the stage is maybe a 6-inch stage. It's not very high. So she's not fond of things that scurry. Won't she be happy that I'm telling the story on her? And she started squealing. So here are these this line of chipmunks, racing up to the front. She starts squealing like hyperventilating. They turn, they go into the audience, and all of the teachers sitting there just raised their feet. They kept looking at me. They raised their feet. The chipmunks went out the back door. They put their feet down. They're still sitting there watching me. So I kind of it was a little distracting, a little interruption, a little distracting. My partner's still over here, kind of hyperventilating. And I said, you don't see that much in Chicago. And this woman in the front seat just sat there she's taking notes. She's sitting there with her pencil. She goes, it happens all the time. So they're just ready for us to just continue. These are the things they deal with all the time. It's a little unusual. It's a little unusual on our part to have like mammals scurrying in the middle of a presentation. But power outages happen. I'll bet in my training in Africa and India that at least 25% of the time that there were power outages that affected the training in one way or another. One, I had to just train the whole thing with no electricity. Frequently there's a delay. There's a 20-minute delay. So if you're doing something that's like an hour and 20 minutes and you've got a 20-minute delay because there's no power, you have to adjust. And what also happens a lot is you ask a question, you give instructions, and you see people just looking at you. Or you ask a question, and you see them just sitting and looking at you. So just because you plan interaction and discussion doesn't mean you're going to get interaction and discussion. So there are some things to just be ready for. That's why you want to kind of have in your hip pocket alternatives. And I suggest that designers, when they're designing things, they've got some alternatives. It'll be helpful.
Now, you have a master's in global talent development. How did that prepare you adequately for what you do?
It helped. It helps. The thing I noticed is no one really is an expert on everything. No one can be an expert on every country. So what we can do is we can prepare ourselves. We can understand, what do I need to do to be prepared, and what do I need to anticipate, and then go. Because I talk to people who have done this a long time, for like many years and have done it in many countries. They look things up. Nobody has everything memorized. Nobody, so yes, it is. Definitely, I learned a lot. But also, I learn a lot every time I do something new. I'm going to the Mideast. I'm going to Dubai later this year. That's going to be my first visit there. I'm going to research and I'm going to be prepared. There's going to be things I didn't anticipate. I guarantee you there's going to be things I didn't anticipate.
Though Dubai is actually pretty westernized in terms of the major cities and stuff. They're actually beautiful cities.
Yes. And the training I'm going to do is actually multi countries. It's going to pull from multi countries. So I'll be able to learn, about different cultures. Yeah, I'm excited about that.
And you're taking that trip with Trish, right? I believe.
Say it again.
You're going to be accompanying Trish Yule on that trip, I believe.
I am. How about that? Travel partners. Yeah.
Now you need to keep Trish safe.
Do I? I think she needs to keep me safe. Yeah, that is a help. When you're going someplace for the first time and you have, somebody who's done it before, or you have an in-country contact and you can ask, all of these questions, help you with your analysis. It's an enormous help, and it increases your odds of success. Yeah. And a lot of the things that we're talking about are actually going to other countries, but it's the same concepts when you're either delivering or designing for a multicultural audience that's anywhere, that's in the United States. It's the same thing. Anytime you're dealing with different cultures, anytime you're dealing with English as a second language, there's lots of things to think. There's lots of things to think about and lots of choice points to consider.
Sounds good. Coline, any last questions in the chat room?
No, I don't believe there are any more questions in the chat room. I think we've covered them all.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, we are at the end of our about 40 minutes. So at this point, Renie, thank you so much for being here, and we wish you safe travels and a happy, fun experience on your next trip. When are you going on your next trip?
September.
September. Well, we definitely wish you safe travels there and a good experience.
Yeah, and I'll be seeing you in Denver pretty soon.
Yes, we will.
Awesome.
Well,
Thanks so much
I can't
for
be
joining
there,
us.
but I'll wish you a hello from here.
All right. Yeah, I'll see you at ASTD ICE.
That sounds great. So everyone in the chat room, thank you for being there. And if you're watching the show again, thanks for watching. And we'll see you next week on eLearnChat. Take care,
Bye.
Coline. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.